Hi, and welcome to today's lesson on slope. This is part 2 of 3 parts where I talk about the topics and questions in the Study Island lesson slope. So if you're working on questions in there, make sure you watch all 3 parts, take your notes and study those, and then go there and get extra practice so you can be as successful as possible there. In today's video, we are looking at 2 special cases with slope, the first one being horizontal and vertical lines, and the second one being parallel and perpendicular lines. So as always, remember you should be taking notes in your math notebook, and you can always, if I go too fast, you can always pause and then rewind. And then you can also pause at the beginning of the question, see what you think the answer is, and then watch the video and see what I get as the answer. And hopefully we get the same thing and you know that you are on task. So I'm excited that you're here, and let's go ahead and learn some more about slope.
Before we look at some examples, I want to go ahead and take a moment to look at some notes. So make sure you have your math notebook out and you're ready to take some notes. If I go too fast or you're not ready yet, go ahead and pause. But otherwise, the first case is horizontal and vertical lines. Horizontal lines are ones that go left to right, just like the horizon where the sun sets. And our acronym to remember what their slope is HOY, or H-O-Y. So this line will be horizontal. That is what our H stands for. Horizontal lines have a 0 slope, so that's what our O here is, the 0. And then our Y, the horizontal line, will cross the Y axis. And so we also have a Mr. Hoy. And a Mr. Hoy, he's pretty short in stature, and he has a pretty round belly. So Mr. Hoy here, he has a 0 slope, and he's horizontal. Hopefully you're a little bit better of an artist than I am in your notes. Okay. And we also have a Mr. Vux. So Mr. Vux, or V-U-X, tells us what a vertical line slope's going to be. So vertical line, that's the one that goes up and down. The line will be vertical. That's what our V stands for. Vertical lines have an undefined slope, and the vertical line will cross the x-axis. So Mr. Vux, he's very tall and lean in his stature. So you could go ahead and draw a Mr. Hoy and Mr. Vux on a little post-it note. Like I said, stick figures, artists, that's not me. But you could draw those on a post-it note, like I was saying, and have those by your computer, and that way you can refer to them and get them kind of in your mind to help you remember the special cases with horizontal and vertical lines. Or you could watch one of these 2 videos for 2 other visuals that I really like that help you to remember which lines have positive, negative slope, and which ones have the undefined and 0 slope. They really are 2 of my favorites, so I highly recommend you taking time to watch them. The other 2 sets of special cases we're going to look at is parallel versus perpendicular lines. Parallel lines, those are your railroad tracks. They're going to continue in the same direction forever, and they never ever cross. Perpendicular lines, they cross at a very special angle. They cross at a 90-degree angle. So they have that perfect right angle where they cross. So when you have parallel lines, those 2 parallel lines are going to have the same exact slope. So examples would be 3 and 3. They're exactly the same. Or -1/2 and -1/2. The 2 numbers are exactly the same. That's how parallel line works. Perpendicular line slopes are opposite reciprocals. So what does that mean? That means opposite means you're going to change the sign, so different signs, positive and negative, And reciprocal means you flip the fraction. So examples here would be 3/2 and -2/3. One has to be positive, one has to be negative. 3 is in the numerator, 3 is in the denominator. They flip the fraction. 2's in the denominator, 2's in the numerator. Another example would be 4 and 1 -1/4, because remember there's an invisible 1 underneath the 4. So when I flip 4 over 1, that becomes 1 over 4. This was positive, so my other one has to be negative. So if you need to pause and catch up on those notes, feel free to do so. And when you're ready, go ahead and move on to the next example. Okay, this is our first example, and it reads, which equation represents a line perpendicular to the line y equals 3/4 x minus 5? Well, we're going to have to figure out what that slope is going to be first. So if you remember back from part 1 of our slope videos, you wanted the equation to be in y equals, which this one already is. So then I just need to find the slope of this equation by looking at the coefficient on x, that number in front of x. So I'm given in the problem a slope of 3/4. So if I look back to my notes, it says that my perpendicular slope is going to be the opposite reciprocal. So that means opposite sign. My first one is positive, so my second one's going to be negative, and then I flip the fraction. So 4 is on top now, 3 is in the bottom. So that means in my answer, I need to have a slope of -4/3. So the only one that has that slope of -4/3 is C. So my answer here is C. Looking at this next example is very similar. It says, which equation represents a line parallel to the line y equals -1/8 x minus 4? Well, my equation's already in that y equals form, so I'm pretty excited because I don't have to rearrange the equation. I just have to look in front of the x to find my slope number. So that coefficient on x is my slope number, which is -1/8. My parallel slopes, that rule says that the slopes are going to be exactly the same. So my new equation of my parallel line is also going to have that -1/8 for a slope. So when I go looking in front of x, there's only one equation that has a parallel slope of -1/8 in front of x. So my answer here is going to be B. Our next example says, which equation represents a line parallel to the line y equals -1/5 x plus 4? So once again, I need to identify the slope in my equation in the question. So that's pretty easy because it's already in that y equals form. So it's my slope in the question is -1/5. It's parallel. So since it's parallel, it's going to be in that exact same slope. So my parallel lines equation, the one in the answers, is also going to have a -1/5. So the only one that has a slope of -1/5 is letter B. So my answer here is letter B. This next equation, it says, which of the statements is true about the two equations below? I have the two equations, and if I look at my choices, they're talking about parallel, same line, perpendicular, not perpendicular, but intersect. So that means they're looking for that parallel perpendicular special case. So I'm going to want to look at my slopes. So these are both in y equals form, so I don't have to do any rearranging. And my slope in the first equation is 2, the number in front of x. And my slope in the second equation is -1/2, the number in front of x there. So remember, if they're going to be parallel, like letter A suggests, those numbers have to be exactly the same. They're not. So it's not letter A. If it was letter B, the exact same line, then when these are in sloped intercept form, that y equals form, they'd have to be the exact same equation, which they're not. So it's not letter B. Okay. Letter C says they're perpendicular. So perpendicular means that these slopes have to be opposite reciprocal. So that means one has to be positive and one has to be negative, which it is, and then they have to be flipped fractions. Well, 2 is really 2 over 1. So when I flip that, that's 1/2. And I change the sign. So that is a perpendicular slope. So my answer is letter C. Now, for it to be letter D, just so you know for the future, they would have to be not parallel and not perpendicular. So any lines that are not parallel and not perpendicular are intersecting but not perpendicular. So if they didn't follow the parallel rules or the perpendicular rules, that's when you would select letter D. But they do follow the perpendicular rule, so our answer is letter C. Now this example, we're getting back into our horizontal and vertical slope rules. So it wants to know, in this example, which equation below represents a horizontal line. Well, horizontal, that acronym was HOI. So horizontal line means it's going to cross the y-axis. So that means I'm looking for y equals a number for a horizontal line equation. So y equals a number. There should be no x in this equation. Is going to be letter D. So that's why we put the y in our acronym to help us remember it crosses the y-axis, and it's also y equals a number in our equation. Now this next example is very similar. It just is asking us which one represents a vertical line now. A vertical line, that's going to be our acronym VUX. So the x there tells us it's going to be x equals a number. So a vertical line crosses the x-axis only, so there's only an x in its equation. So the only choice here that's x equals a number is letter C. So that's our answer. This equation here, it says, or example here, what statement describes the line that contains the points below? And if I look at my choices, it talks about the slope being positive, vertical, slope being negative, or horizontal. So that means that tells me as I look at my answers, that I'm going to want to calculate what the slope is. So if I remember back from part 1 of this video series on slope, my formula for slope is to subtract the y's and subtract the x's. So I can actually go ahead and even label my points here, xy, xy. So when I subtract my y's, it's going to be negative 1/4 minus a negative 1 over negative 3 minus a negative 3. And when I do that subtraction, I end up with a negative 3 on the top and a 0 on the bottom. So when you have a 0 in the denominator or the numerator, that's a big red light, a big flashing red light, that this is going to be either undefined or 0. So when you have a 0 in the denominator, you can't have a 0 in the bottom of a fraction. Because if you think about it, this is saying you have one of 2 parts. That's what 1/2 means. Can you have one of 0 parts? Does that even make sense? No, that can't happen. That's not defined. It's undefined. So when you have a 0 in the denominator, that means you're going to have an undefined slope. And if you remember back to our acronym VUX, that U stands for undefined. So that means the V is vertical. My answer is going to be B because that line is vertical because I have an undefined slope. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you learned something new.